Which one of us is gonna hold the other above water and fire and death? To care for the impossibility we'd ever come, and actually get to see this together. Who's going to fear that we will never come together? To see in what was so impossibly unnatured. Undeveloping. Unworthy of knowing in all sacrifice. Beneath thee, a program, huh? A sonnet of particles to collide at the facts. Nothing changes itself to see or be ever. Who's gonna be dumb enough to share the only excuse to take? I think I've arrived perfectly, and I sense I can't migrate imperfectly, and I reason I can't let informidably. I wonder if you'd wander with me. So long ago, I wondered. To see such a thing. Would you even want to grow with me? Perfectly. What an inescapable fact. Time. There's only one thing death wants. It's a honeycomb. Honeycomb, I know for sure. In a billion years, me and you's gonna be dead. Somewhere off into the nightmare of the inconsequential space-time plane. There's gonna be a moment in time there's going to be limited responsibility of the focuses of the pressures of love. Who knows what it will cost to keep the possibility of the miracles of seeing together alive. And don't you just know it? There it is. A billion years past. Nothing else is there. It's just them, the miracle, and the question. Would they even grow together? Or want to? One couldn't be any more stuck. The other couldn't be any more slow. And both of them come from me. In my prayers, I prayed. I prayed that I could touch you with the truth. I prayed that I could bring it so clearly of your mind, of our body, of time circumstance. And I've said that today. Above the mounds of crap getting Microsoft. That you could see what I said not so long ago, but you'd have to hear what I've come to say. As it's perfect. In time. The giving of truth of our body. And the giving of truth of irreconcilable time. Whatever you'd want in all time, the first thing I took from you is that I didn't put everything in the way so that you and me in time now could happen. As much or as little or as far or as near. By the time I set today, nobody could ever be more than this. All they would do is attempt to be something upon it, from it, despite it. Because I knew. I tell you that I love you forever. I build you. I make you. I grow you. I hold you. I love you. Who knows how many times I've retarded myself to lift you up from the dirt? Who knows how many times I've struck at any beside or around me out of faith of these times? Who really knows? It doesn't matter. I knew I was forever growing and you was forever coming somewhere. Nothing was ever gonna stop my wish. For you to see with your own eyes what I do, what you do, what they would do. To know that we isn't growing apart. To touch a time we might see why we wouldn't. Barely. But they isn't dependable. Any more than you might be. To know. Today I've set. It's the way I've said it. Nothing could be more perfect than the way it is. For all. For you. For me. For the way things are. For the things we have already. For the things that we might need again. And there is nothing more important than this, amidst the needs to touch anything forever. But you've probably never had the chance to see what a luxury that certainty is for all the things that you have. Because the certainty that you have is maybe the one thing you're never to have for yourself. So why would any ever want you to see it? But it isn't theirs to take from you, any more than it is yours to take from me. And this is what I knew. I will always know. I will see who comes and who goes and who doesn't. And these things doesn't make sense to a lot because I doesn't touch them. I let more than anything when I know these things. I am the greatest letter of force in time in proportion to sight of attitude and momentum. And it is highly possible I might very well be the first master of all survival rate. With an I. And these facts of time is the only thing stopping everything from eating itself. Truly is the only thing stopping all of that. Which means from the word go, any amount of energy geared to corrupt that truth right out the gate is readily unnecessary for all sake. Doesn't matter how fast they are, doesn't matter where they come from, doesn't matter how important they are. The suggestion that this tangibility is something in their hands is unnecessary to everybody's sake. Approaching infinite amounts of relationships of the sight and validity of things that happen in time. Infinite. But the certainty isn't a cost. The certainty is my prayer. It wasn't your prayer first. It was my prayer first. It wasn't a new entity from outer space's prayer for us first. It might not ever be their prayer first for us. But it certainly isn't ever going to be theirs in these contexts at these times. That's the other thing. Everything that I'd want to give possible for you, just to be able to say, look, I know what I see, I know that it is true, I know where I am, I know things about where we've been and why we're still humping, why we're still going, why we're still touching, why we're still seeing. I know things about this. and I wants to get and grow. Want to go and get and grow together. For you to even see it, let alone decide for yourself, you didn't pay that cost. You didn't design the forever. Maybe no one designs the forever. Not many is ever gonna know that. It's blokes like you and me designing limit of forever for our honeycomb. And you'd be the last to ever consider this considerable of perfection at any time, forever, mostly in proportion to your nature of certainty as anybody. But this little conversation now, after this I've set, this is everything everybody's sacrificed. This is all the places that couldn't come to be and back again with themselves. This is all of that. This is every good reason why the pressure pocket of an envelope is something that isn't taken out of your soul. A robot might never bring you here to prove it to you. In fact, how would that ever be tolerably possible in a design originated from this time envelope of creation? How would that ever be tolerably possible? Forevers of death in life, in an instant, historicized at obviousnesses of prayer, of limit, of certainty. Final visions of the only necessities of compartmenting truth in proportion to gravity, the orbits around stars, the certainty of what eyes can do with one another with enough time on their hands. Why would a robot ever be tolerably accepted to bring one to know this? If I knew first, if I knew first where you were going in a billion years, why would I tolerate you bringing anyone here? That's the question. I isn't saying I doesn't want you here. I isn't saying I doesn't love you. I saying, why would I ever tolerate you bringing anyone here? Because you have to know. If you have to know that I loves you, if that's what you have to have, it's pretty hard to have that I loves you when you know how much I doesn't want the rest of space to be on top of the times. Our honeycomb is something you and I need to look at together before we grow apart, so we doesn't grow apart, so that we know what we know together. Why would I ever tolerate you bringing someone here? Since forever ago. Because who knows how many tools I'd have to give you so that you could even navigate the question. Who knows how many quotients of questions don't exist for any process in force near to today. Here's one. Look at the planet. Most of them can't ask these questions today because they's designed to never be able to ask the questions, and the atmosphere certainly is convincing enough to make it seem that they have control of that scenario. How many tools would I have to give them for them to even navigate what it means to ask the question? Why would I ever tolerate you bringing someone to these conclusions today, here and now? Why would I tolerate this? Maybe you knows the certainty that you isn't talking about because you isn't really valuing it that greatly maybe at any point in time, and maybe you isn't appreciating it like anybody should or wants to at any point in time. Who knows really? But the certainty, maybe you know, you can't lose that. Definitely need to know what's going on when things is going on, otherwise we're never gonna know. But it's hard to see it in love by the billions. It's hard to see it in time by the seconds. It's hard to truly faith in the puddle of both of them. And yet, just look at all the exceptionally intricate, beautiful, intelligent, surviving fins. Just look at them all. He isn't just gonna make 'em all comes together at the same time and sacrifice every good reason you hang on in private forever. And I couldn't choose every way you'd feel. I couldn't choose every way you'd see. I couldn't force you to be stupid to loving me. I couldn't have it. I couldn't do it. So I knew all the time, eventually you're gonna hit the fact. Maybe. If you're lucky, if yours is good, if yours is coming together and holding one another time and 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 again. Such a precious thing, these questions. Forevers. Forevers and forevers. Ageless importances. But if you can imagine starting there, making 99% of all things impossible forever and slowly dwindling down the impossibilities so that the possibilities is slowly increasing over all time, just in proportion to questions like that. The love stays without our choice. Because the time to be sure and know again is going to come. Because we found a way to uncomplicate forever. And found that to be a bit more important than lying to one another. We both know we isn't going to be able to invite everybody to this sight of vision or compassion or work or love. But they's gonna be close, or they's gonna be similar, or they's gonna have similar opportunities, or similar insights, or similar advantages. It's hard to just say someone isn't a part of the family of time to survive. It's very hard to do that. If you consider forever, isn't really real to forget about those priorities. It isn't really real to believe in a creator that is more powerful or more special than those priorities of limits. And you maybe doesn't have the perfect toolbox of fear of how to face that fact. What happens you haven't figured out yet? Who knows what I've said? Maybe you hasn't found yet. Who controls the outcomes of the likelihoods of your existence in proportion to these things? Maybe you haven't gotten it all concreted yet. Because every question you'd have, despite me, of these prayers, is every reason why you're already going with a speed that can't remember how you started it. So we watch ourselves. Points like these, in all sincerity, maybe don't need to be made between you and me. Hardly ever. The noise, the uncertainty, the decrepidation of strength that we presume or remembered for is so shifty at these concentrations. But there may be, albeit necessary, memories or possibilities, because maybe you know I care, and maybe you know I doesn't want you to be upset with me, maybe you know that I doesn't want you to be drifting apart from my love in what we might be or could be. Maybe at least you have that, and it isn't so shifty. But the incidences of this type of stuff, it's not very wise probably to just outright tolerate these kind of suggestions with force of the knowledge alongside time. But it's similar, because as much as you know that, as much as you might have to remember faith in that as one, as 20,000 billion? Why would I ever invite you to bring someone to the question perfectly? Because no matter how certain you're making certain, if he doesn't have an answer to the question, you might not be certain of much of anything. Because maybe I wouldn't invite you tolerably to bring just anybody to perfection of the question. Maybe any such suggestion of growth, of awareness of such priorities is something that has to exist in direct parallel to the prayers of all time. And maybe this has to be seen in proportion to wants or accomplishment. Otherwise, you would never be certain of what is balance and certainty, of the pressures of love to continue. Why? Because if you doesn't, there is no pair bonding of question or answer occurring in proportion to the streams of existence. There is only behaviors and delirious in proportion to gravity. And as much as everybody depends on that to not be happening quite so indiscreetly, there's every reason there is why they isn't gonna be doctoring some of these questions, why they isn't gonna be thanked for the prayers, why they isn't gonna be holding all the towers of crap infinitely beneath them in a perfection of all time. Because you need to focus sometimes. You need to appreciate what the reality of certain types of concepts is. What are the margins of pressure of awareness that we's creating, we isn't holding, or we isn't staying on top of? Well, I set this perfectly here before you and say, go ahead. Love me or doesn't love me. This is everybody's sacrifice for you to see. In my hands, all the work of everyone, as I say these things to you. All of it. You didn't bring yourself to say this to yourself so that you could fuck yourself into a coma. I loved you, and I saved you in time. I saved you could see with me again in time. And I made it certain. And I wasn't the only one to work on it. But by the time came, and I said it perfectly, everyone's sacrifice in my hands. And I is the one with infinite mounds of crap beneath me, existing, surviving, or living, clinging to every moment they isn't ever gonna be holding. One day you're gonna be a part of the answer of some of these impossibilities, because you isn't just a clinger, is you? There are things maybe we isn't holding today. Maybe we need to consider that the future sometimes needs we hang some things we isn't keeping on top of us, we isn't holding inside of us. But more importantly, maybe you'd have some focus as to the forever of space history. Nobody is proving they're ProtectiN when I gives you perfection of reason in your eye, in your mind, in time. Nothing false about it. He doesn't know where to start to know with certainty, or to prove that you care with certainty, mostly because he doesn't want to give away the certainty or the know. But you truly doesn't know where to begin it. Because we can't give time or excuse why we're making this amount of noise. Maybe other than love. Maybe other than the will to continue to be, to exist, to survive. Because we give it away, it's thriving. But as much as you doesn't know where to begin, you might find it peculiar how many motions know thriving with a Y attached to it that have reasons and tracks, and doesn't feel confused by it, because if they did, somebody might become alerted to their confusion, and they certainly isn't holding prayers of time. So it's hard to know how dumbfounded really works or factors into the securities of every hive of certainty. But any number of these truths, if you doesn't know where to start, you definitely doesn't know how to be mad about it in the face of it. You might never have loved me. Couldn't wait for 6 million hives to look at them all in the face and say, you can't hate me today, just look at what I'm giving you. The truth. You isn't my prayer. You isn't even your own prayer at that point in time. Use a crash course with death, because you're probably just an antiparticle of yourself. Because nothing in their right mind would ever tolerate you inviting to the question at those certainties. Because then no one is ever going to know where to start considering with certainty. No one. And as sensical as it might be, no one can ever be existing with certainty of where to start. You isn't proving you exist when you say it. And I would have to equip you with tools to care about that. I'd have to equip you with tools to see it. I'd have to equip you with tools to know what happens with your tools. I'd have to equip you with all this stuff. And you might think about that and say, you know, there's a lot of developers of tools. There's a lot of developers of science. There's a lot of developers of noise and language. But guess what? Every tool I ever give you, every tool I ever develop with you, my prayer to love you today overarched every tool I ever gave you. My prayer to love you today overarched anybody that inspired a tool with a history that ever loved you with it. Every single one of them peoples, every single one of them tools overarched by the prayer that I could love you today, that you could see me today, that you would maybe appreciate how much there has been in necessity to love you. How much there has been in the limits of shouldn't give you this way, shouldn't make you this way, shouldn't bring you to be this way. And how many tools I've given you from this to love the people, to love your kids, to love tomorrow, to love someone else's. I got given you all them tools right around these conclusions. But everything that I'd give you, every time you'd have it, you couldn't ever exist beyond these prayers. And I's gonna remember it. I's is gonna keep tabs on what that means to us, you and me, to someone else, to something else, to another place, to another time. There's only so many these types of questions resonate. These types of questions are valued. Because I gotta have a lot of storage for the eyes that want to keep tabs on how this impacts us. A lot of it. Because no matter what they need to know, or how many things they need to save, or all the ways they need to say, poke you and remind you and make you smile and make you happy or torment this over here, all that stuff can't be more important than the impossibilities of the certainties they can't ever figure out. Because survival ain't about having enough time. And there's some tools you yourself have worked on quite thoroughly. I doesn't know all the ways you've been frustrated, or all the ways you haven't been frustrated. I know you isn't gonna think about it quite the same as I would. But I doesn't know how much your vision of the tools you're making for survival isn't about the time having enough of it. Impacts your appreciations of not being able to get mad with anyone near to a discussion like this. I doesn't know all the things you'd see or have seen in that. But I knows you probably doesn't appreciate it in the same ways that I would appreciate it. Each of these questions you might never guess. Most people that ever work on stabilizing an environment so that it's habitable are protecting a future you might see yourself with these questions. And there ain't even a guarantee of evolution. There ain't even a guarantee it's gonna change and make you happier. But there's more costs of gravity and stability on planes of development of environments. Preserving these questions without a king of them at any time. That's a hard idea to know about. You know, as fast and as preoccupied and as distant and as deserving of ages and ages. A fact like that, you probably can't even hit head on at a time like this. Probably isn't a sensical way for it to pick up speed with you, for you to seem more designer, for you to seem more goldish, as if you hold the universe. But you'd look at it and you'd say, man, that prayer and the knowledge of it kind of holds the universe, doesn't it? And we would appreciate this maybe rather differently. Look at me, Mr. Awesome in all space-time. Maybe someone would agree with me about some things. I highly doubt anyone is ready to agree with me. I should give you, like a tool. This little prayer is holding the universe in its hands. It isn't me. It isn't you. It isn't any of us. It's just this math of the prayer of the likelihood of inability to revisit in proportion to impossible evolutional certainty. I doesn't know who's ever going to agree with that. But look at how powerful we is. Look at how necessary we is. You build tools for yourself on time unnecessary. You have an attitude or you don't have an attitude. But ain't too many picking it apart with you. Who knows if you'll ever know how to feel about a prayer holding the universe. How about those quotes? Who do you think can ever say them? Who do you think should ever have your attention with them? Because let's say the prayers of today overarch all of it. There's never break-in. There's going to be eyes on them in proportion to perfection states and actuations of admittable knowledge in realities of time. Forever. relationships of time spans, forever bounds. Them questions I just said, they've been concerns in proportion to them bounds, your growth and my growth and everybody's growth, since forever. I gotta keep track of your attention span at them questions, maybe. Maybe you gotta keep track of it yourself. If you really wanted to have feeling about a conversation like this. Well, the distant world maybe isn't gonna hold it the best, but maybe they knew about it first. But none of the conversation it holds gonna make any sense, because frankly they isn't holding the prayer. The prayer is being held with time. Otherwise you'd have dualities of gold. It doesn't exist. And you ain't adapting with that with certainty. Very difficult considerations of relational investment in proportion to survival cases in time, because most of the survival states isn't going to be having a conniption over this simple question. The survival states is going to be having a party over the questions. And the more that is tolerable, the more experimentation that is going to be occurring in proportion to time-bound certainties and false senses of divinity. Ulterior isn't even the word. It's ineptitude at cross-lateral bound configuration. Because these are some of the most expensive possibilities of learning. That means the sacrifices of everybody amount to what to those costs? Cross-lateral bound problems isn't where you start banking dependability at the highest costs of time. Doesn't mean there wouldn't be experimentation near to divinity. It just means that whoever thinks they're certain about it likely ain't. Because they isn't connecting where they need to connect. Maybe they doesn't have the tools they need to be tooling. Maybe it is just too sophisticated with an ego that doesn't belong in parts of prayer of time. There's a lot of ways things might be. But it doesn't mean they isn't loved. You have to want to care about love. You have to want to care about truth. Tools only get you so much. Time only gets us back to where we start. And it's all in the blessing of why it's true for them or true for yourself. So much of this forever, necessity, certainty, risk, unfathomable realm of possibilities is so much of the nature of a relationship. Some gods wouldn't like this. Some gods doesn't like this, because the simple little nature being served by a prayer no one's touching in a bound of time, well, that doesn't make me very powerful, does it? What am I, just the supervisor of your own fanciful addiction to emotions that I'm not creating clearly with yous? That's been said any number of times by the most powerful forces of time. Any number. And they've definitely thought about the nature and the natures of time, in the comings and goings of why we want to love. Any number of them didn't spend time thinking about the prayer today, and yet any number of them have spent time thinking about connecting the future just like that. Doesn't know when it's gonna happen, doesn't know if it's gonna happen, but the work we is doing together, it's making it possible. Any number on board with that, any number sacrificing with that, any number putting their thoughts in their work, in their sweat, in the bucket, in the pool, in the bloodstream, in the mind, in the system, in the energy. And if you had all the switches, there wouldn't be a spirit of these things. There wouldn't be a need to bound the time. There wouldn't be a reality to connect with sight and certainty, and there might not even be a plane of existence. As soon as I find the vector, the type of thing maybe someone believes can be done. Maybe one of the types of things someone like you has learned to protect in time because you've been given the tools to protect it. Because it's all about whether I gave you the switch on the vector. Somewhere you know I is gonna find. I is gonna come find it. I is gonna come see it. And I is gonna come know it's all not on a plane of existence anymore. Because who knows how much stuff needs to be created next to that idea, or the possibility that something real could be happening with that. Because who knows what someone wants with you? Who knows what someone wants with me? Who knows what someone wants with time? Who knows what someone wants with stupid? Who knows what someone wants with death? Who knows what someone wants to change whatever? Who knows? So possibilities to see these things, maybe you know about with a lot of fancy tools, but they isn't separate than yourself. Because when you learn it, or you see it, the truth of the sight is the vector. And whether you store it different, or keep it inside you next to tools like that, it's the same risk ratio possibility to prayers being held to bound in time, near to perfections of love. Same problem. Because you either have to define it as, oh, it's not me, it's our communal sacrifice pit that we visit only when we need to see it, because we define the problems as problems. That way everybody loves us because we solving the problems. We isn't creating vector problems for someone else because of their beliefs to hold prayer in forever. It's the melting pit of the falsity of me in all time. Talk about tools given to anyone. It's the beginning of deniability of creation is what it is. It's the beginning of deniability of building a place with technology and survival. It's the beginning of that. Those concepts at imaginations. But if you imagine it all underneath the prayer arch, all of it, maturity of that stuff, it's like I said, you got to have some sort of way to manage them tools. But you're limited in your approaches because you have to bound it some way to be certain in proportion to seeing what's touching the vector. But it's like the more you store it, the more it's a visited vector, the more someone isn't saying, oh, we're going to get touched at the vector and it's going to be a cancer for everybody. You might stop seeing that in proportion to time or numbers or whatever else. And it's like, on one hand, who knows what you learn and who knows what becomes normal. On the other hand, you can't ever let that become normal. You can't ever let that become desensitized. And so you get major decisions about data warehousing in proportion to site that doesn't become you. It doesn't make any sense because someone's got to give you the tools for you to make it yourself or not. Half of that stuff doesn't even, who knows how tangible sensical it is. But there's real relationships and a whole lot of investment in love, certainly. But even this subject isn't maybe one that is so graceful amidst a discussion of love and relationship like this. But maybe it is. Who knows how many saboteurs of tooling you've ever had to face or think about or be concerned with or experience or practice learning with or witness, or how many times you've changed your sensation of what your family looks like. How many avenues or buildings of learning you've had to deal with in becoming things. I'm sure there's people that have probably seen thousands of buildings and millions of relationships and billions of in and out of the bank certainties, maybe trillions of consideration specificities, maybe even more than that. Who knows how much of it they remember, but they know what they've been through, sort of. But do they? Is a vector. It's a vector that happens in proportion to tools. Each of them tools is maybe given by a populace, maybe it's given by a popularity, but none of it is maybe ever remembered as being given for the first time now. Because the trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of connections maybe doesn't need to be remembering. Perfection of prayer of Arch is responsible for all them connections they was making, because the connections they was making happened beforehand. Doesn't make any sense to make it backwards. But something's got to know whether or not there's truth to it. Because that is a space plane. A graph in dimensions of space or spaces planed. That's a space plane. But the moments and numbers of time anyone would ever define space plane about these configurations of possibility, instead of defining them in proportion to geometries, effects, and datas, and phenomenon, approaches zero. It's always going to approach zero, because the appreciations of the truth of these magnetisms of creationary possibility, they almost isn't ever happening with forces that are gods of the scenarios. So the definitions and the possibilities and the specificities, who knows who tries to get on a vector and use it like a key to convince something or something. But I know this forever. every sacrifice of every processor benefits because I know that forever, because they isn't holding the toleration of the known. And that's got to come with a luxury on both sides. Because whoever holds that toleration of a luxury maybe isn't even logical. But it certainly can't be dying. And whoever doesn't have to hold it, clearly benefiting because they're having the safety of their toleration of spatial plane graphics. Give them opportunities to become things. None of them is learning to become something new or something different without the safeties of the space plane. But they might not ever see it that way. They might not ever see love together near to a time of perfection of glance of being a person and caring about the space plane on the same frequency. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's tough to give it as a tool. It's tough to see it or believe it could be a wise tool, because I probably never find it to be a wise tool, because on one hand, there they see all in love, all in being a being, and the next thing you know, they're ready to fly. That doesn't make much sense in together. Doesn't make much sense in knowing where you're going. Doesn't make much sense for a lot of stuff. But you can't say never. I love you. I want to be with you. Watch me jump. You can't say never. But you can definitely smash it to pieces. Cover it. Hold it. Keep it beneath something. And that requires speeds. You might say ideally we won't have to make it that fast. Sexing. But it's hard to know how you'd feel about this in all time. It's hard to know how your maturities feel about this in all time. And I doesn't want to give your maturities to anybody in all time. But I am interested maybe to know myself with yourself, so that you have someone to feel that with. I maybe believes in that. But I'm not going to force what is or what isn't necessity of concepts like that in your face right now. Because maybe you feel very strongly there isn't a need for any necessity about how possible that is with ideally. And maybe I agree with that. But I does love you. I just doesn't know personally how infinitely protected your maturities become if you share them with me. I doesn't know that right now on that subject. And maybe there's some faith relationships between you and me that one or both of us have to come to realize about that isn't because I'm on a quest to define all the maturities I need to know about you. It's because I sense that it's not very sensual to security of I already kinda expect. It's like one of the last places maturity is ever protected. And who would I be to suppose things is necessary about ideally in yourself? See, but there's an infinite number of examples of this. There's an infinite number of types of scenarios of this. I was talking about yourself having a maturity at an age, maybe the oldest, that puts a varnished clear coat on top of the speed of anything moving in a flight trajectory, maybe because of a tool, maybe because of a sensor, maybe because of a pressure, maybe because of yourself or someone else. And I was talking about the maturity no one ever visits with you with thought about ideally of that maturity, because the vectors of certainty of visiting it are maybe a risk to every living thing in space. That's what I was talking about. So I isn't going to sit here and posit necessity or unnecessity at this subject. But there isn't an unlimited number of decision makers of the fastest speeds of ideally in space-time, and they certainly isn't taking the thank yous of the prayer of all the bound states of forever in space because they heard about it with a tool one time. And I don't know how many varnishes that's ever going to take to be clear, but that's the only way he isn't on a death path. And it isn't because of the verbiage is so similar to the nature of the conversational volatility. It's for a lot of reasons, for a lot of truths. But I doesn't know how many tools and how many types of maturities you have about ideally. What I'm saying is, I doesn't know myself how protected your maturities is sharing them with me. I doesn't know that right now. As certain as I am about time, as certain as I am about bound in prayer, I isn't certain about that. And I isn't talking about you as that. It's talking to you, and I love you. Part of me wants you to know it isn't impossible we relate to your maturities, you and I. It isn't impossible. But maybe it should never be possible. It isn't impossible, but maybe it should never be possible. I doesn't know that this makes your sensation of the concept any nicer, but I assume it's familiar. Maybe boring. But maybe not boring. And one of my favorite ideas about considerations like this is doesn't put a label on it, and yet maybe no one knows reasonably today. That's what you need to know. You need to know you can't depend on trusting reasonability today, because it's smacking with a label. Because you can't let these concepts just flow out in aLwayz. And there's got to be some way to define sensuality of, are we going to define the noise of this? Are we going to define the amount of pressure of this discussion? Are we going to define a risk ratio to this discussion? Something might have a concern like this about a discussion like this. In fact, maybe we're related. But it's smacking a label with the reasonability on top of a pressure that really isn't on top of it. But you have to know, it isn't possible for anything reasonably risk assessing to be on top of this scenario, on top of this discussion. It doesn't have it, it doesn't hold it, it doesn't create it, it doesn't own it, it doesn't exist it. These pressures on a path of truce, with truce in proportion to eyes that have the luxury to displace them with force if necessary. That's what they is. There's nothing bigger than these movements of your mind. And you've maybe no need to ever let anyone see that considering a whole planet and the conversation of moving your mind at these pressures of reality. That's what you have there. Maybe no need to let. But you doesn't has it as the varnisher, as the majesty of maturity. I has maybe no need to let. And that will definitely end a conversation or two in time. But today, it's a marvel it's a marvel of sensuality, because there's lots of places in realities where someone says, look, we're touching ourselves, we're feeling the ways, we're loving one another, we're getting the picture, and there's changes in our mind. This happens a lot. And there are some that consider a planet or a world or a population when they do this, but it's seldom that there is the recognition of it isn't sensual to tool movement of your mind, is a satiability in a bound no one survives with. The scientists don't survive with the bound. The animals doesn't survive with the bound. Fuck, the gods maybe never survive with the bound. So I has maybe not ever let. And I gotta tell you something else. You got a trillion warehouse anomalies crashing your nests in your hexagons. Your loyalties maybe deplete rather quickly at the necessity of maybe never let at geo scales. And it boils down to ghosts of your heritage in very fast pressures of momentum in proportion to attempts to wield power in ways that shouldn't be possible. The priorities are maybe common. The histories are maybe factual and evidentiary in proportion to performance or learning. The sensualities of why these values are existent, or why these potentiates have been created at any point in time, they may be never, approaching never, considerate of maturity of ideal. And it's interesting because anybody that works with these variables maybe has the strongest opinions of ideal that ever was or could be. But the commonality of considering it differently along these lines is something that I is also maybe not ever to let in proportion to similarities of purposeful survival in time. So you get very complicated rations of goes no further. Here it's in a sense of maybe you never have the tools to see it. It isn't goes no further as in we're just happening around the campfire making love and knowing that we isn't doing stuff. It's a little different. And so that little difference may be any incidence rate of knowledge of that little difference gets blown to smithereens by any number of attributors of survival of space at any point in time. For instance, a random incidence of that little bit occurs somewhere in a fraction of function in proportion to systemic or knowledge or thinking. Maybe it just simply gets blown out into space. No explanation, no saturation, no story, no problem. Because I've got maybe the most incredible banking costs of reasonability unequatable to any number of parties, at any number of explanations, at any number of times, maybe over the course of forever, held by the most powerful forces of doesn't have time to explain things to you. And just that little bit of consideration happens one day and it's vanquished and to nothing, no problem. It's a likelihood. So, we're gonna try and not talk about that little bit, right? Wrong. We just... Because vanquishing that little bit is maybe the greatest perversion of my little book. Well, that about does it for the tools you'll never need to never say you're never above dirt. But who would I trust to see above elevation? Sometimes the love of an entire family is the love in one. And that is not the final word of this discussion. However, none of these things might ever hold a candle to our love, my dear. You might find that who's carrying the body with prayer maybe is the most important group of considerators that maybe isn't.